Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3, close to the bottom of page 1390. 1390. With the subject being the difference between Beriyah Yetzirah, which is the context of Talmud and Mishnah. One is Beriyah Yetzirah, is a state of concealment, and one is a state of revelation, Yetzirah, and the quality that even though it's a lower level, but revelation and integration and internalization has something over even a higher level that's still in a state of concealment, or like we learned earlier, a raw state where it's not yet fully shaped. And that's the quality, the advantage of Yetzirah over Beriyah. And he explained it's similar, Lahoyer, we can comment on it, the difference between Igulim and Yesher. Igulim Makif is a higher level than Pnimi, but Pnimi is revealed. Pnimi is internalized, it's a revealed state. Makif remains concealed. So though Igulim is higher than Yesher, but Igulim is the level of Nefesh, and Yesher is the level of Ruach. And that's similar to the difference between Beriyah and Yetzirah. Beriyah being Igulim, like he says, and Yetzirah being Yesher. And that's why it is the Ruach of the Nekudim, and does the Tikkun and repair of those kings that died, which is the Shviras HaKelim of Tohu, the Berurim that it accomplished, as he explained in the parentheses. Another association it has is with Tagin and Oisius. That the Hebrew letters, you have the letters themselves, that's Yesher. Tagin is like the crowns on top. That's Igulim. So though the Tagin are higher, but like he said, but from there, and they are the level of Bina, and the Asius is level Zah and Malchus. So Bina is in the world of Beriyah, Ima Mekanana B'Kersaya. So again, Beriyah. And that's the level of Tagin. And that is the Nefesh in the Asius, not the Ruach, the Nefesh. And the Oisius themselves, that's like the Oiris, like the Tagin, that they stand above the letter. So too, these are energies like he calls it, and they stand from it, and they only see a diminished flow, a diminished reflection from a distance. So it's referring to a level, Eris Makif from the Teir, so that's the level of Nefesh. And from this, you can extrapolate that Oisius, the letters themselves, is Yesher, because the Oisius express the words, the letters express the idea. So it's a lower level than the Tagin, but it's revealed. So it's like the level of Yetzirah Ruach. So that's what we learned yesterday. And I gave a lot more overview and at length, which I'm not going to go over again now. You could always listen to yesterday's class. One thing that did strike me, I wanted to point out, I was thinking about this, that I've explained why Talmud and Mishnah work this way, that Mishnah is the revelation of Mikra. The Mikra, everything is very compact, concentrated, bekitzer, brief. Like Chabad, it originates in Chabad of Atzilus. But it manifests in story form and in very brief, the mitzvahs without details, without explanation. Mishnah is like the midas, the chagas, that elaborates and fleshes it out. Talmud, however, is taking Mishnah to another level with his darkness, you don't have the crystal clarity that Mishnah has. So that makes sense, therefore, that Talmud is in Beriyah, because it's a darker state. Through the effort and exertion, you can reach a level of Ayin that's even higher than Chochma Chabad and Chochma and Chagas of Atzilus, meaning into Keser, like we learned. But that's because you're exerting yourself to reach to the source of it all. So that's why it's a higher level. But it's still coming through a darkened state. It's not coming initially like a crystal clear, as it is in Yetzirah, of Chagas of Atzilus, that manifests in Yetzirah, where everything is very clear. So that is fine. And that's why Yetzirah, the Yetzirah, the of Mishnah, has this quality, because it's a revelation of what was in brief, in concentrated form, in summary and concise in the Mikra. But there's the other side. He brought another thing, that Beriyah is like chomer, like raw matter that's not been shaped yet. And Yetzirah was beginning to become shaped, at least in general terms, and then obviously in Tikkun, it becomes fully shaped in all the details, a finished product. So I was thinking, how do you associate that to Mishnah and Talmud? Why would Talmud be more raw matter than Mishnah? If indeed, if Talmud is an explanation of Mishnah, if anything, Talmud should be more details than the Mishnah has, because it's spelling it out. So here's my thought on this. This is just a complete speculation, but I'm speculating because I don't know if it's going to be addressed, that perhaps this is the pshat. In Mishnah, everything is very clear for the Bali Mishnah, for those teachers, the sages, Rabbeinu HaKadosh, who received that crystal clear Mesorah that was passed on from generation to generation all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu. Good. What happened then is the beginning of the concealment. So you needed the sages now, the Talmudic sages, to come and start digging and evaluating and analyzing and arguing and trying to get clarity in a darkened state. For them to do so, if you recall, he said you have to go back to where the author originated, the origins of where the author drew the initial intelligence before he wrote, which is back to what we remember, Sefer and Sefer, that he goes back all the way to the way it was first given by God to Moshe Rabbeinu. So it's not enough just to analyze the words on the page, but you have to go back to the source, the Ayin of Keser. So perhaps the word is like this, that in Mishnah, it's like a shaped piece of clay. I don't want to use the word clay, but a shaped entity, because Mishnah is spelling out what it says in the Mikra in details. But then when it's concealed, the only way to get that clarity, you have to go back to the original raw matter in Beriyah, before it was shaped, to be able to draw from there and understand the clarity, even in a state which is not so, with state of darkness. So though Yetzirah and Mishnah is where it plays itself out, you have all the halachas, what's kosher, what's not kosher, what's allowed, what's not, and it spells it all out. But in a case where you can't find that clarity, you have to go back to so-called how the potter shaped the clay in the first place, which would be going back to Beriyah, going back to the Chomer, which has to go back to the Ayin Elaki, like he said, that radiates in Beriyah. At the bottom of page 1387, he said that the Gili B'chinas Ayin Elaki Shevelam HaBeriyah, because it's the first yes, you go back to the way it was first shaped. And that helps clarify things that you cannot see openly in Yetzirah for those that it's concealed from them, as in contrast to the Bali Mishnah, that they have that revelation. Just wanted to add that into the equation. Okay, with that said, I'm going to continue reading now. 8 lines from the bottom of page 1390, and the pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. So now, after you explain now these two levels, Beriyah Yetzirah, Igulim and Yesher, Nefesh and Ruach, Tagin and Oisius, they're all in the same category. That's how he's describing it. So now he's going to continue to develop this further by saying, V'hine nizbar le'il. Now, it was explained earlier, previous page, if you recall, in the parentheses, he brought from the Ramban in the name of the Sefer Yetzirah that the first step was Yotzer Meteyu Mamish. And the Pasuk Bereshis, he said that first he shaped from Teyu, then became something that from a state of Ayin came a state, because Teyu is Chemer Hiyuli, it's Beriyah. Teyu is like Beriyah, like the unshaped matter. That's why it's called Tohu. From the word Tohu means like wonder, amazement, even more than amazement. It's more like being baffled. We don't know what it is because it's unshaped yet. Like he brought, Rashi says that. And he brings it here. You can't call it with any name because it doesn't yet have shape and form. So it doesn't have description and form. And he created mamoshes. And what is that? That's boihu. So from toyu came boihu. The toyu v'voyu. So toyu is bria, unshaped, and voyu is the beginning of shape. Boihu, and there you're beginning to see, discern the shape of the matter. And then would come a third level, asiya, which is tikkun. But that's what he said. Basically, that Beriyah Yetzirah corresponds to Tohu and Vohu. So now he's going back to that and citing that here and explaining what we're discussing. What we're discussing here, Beriyah Yetzirah, as one being unshaped, meaning it's still in a concealed state, and one is beginning to take on shape and form. Vohu, Tohu Vohu, like he said back there. Let's see, just see. But it's still Ayin because you don't see the details yet. Okay. So now he says, "V'hinen is bar le'il the Beriyah nikra Tohu, the Yetzirah Vohu." That's Beriyah Yetzirah. So now the Rebbe Rashab is going to explain how this Tohu and Vohu is similar to the same idea, Beriyah Yetzirah, Igulim and Yesher, and he's going to base it on the Gemara. So here's the thoroughness. The Rebbe Rashab is now bringing a Gemara and Chagiga. Uba Gemara Chagiga Daf Yud Beis Amud Aleph. The Gemara in Chagiga 12a says like this on the pasuk, "V'notala kav Tohu v'avnei Vohu," that he drew out on it. V'notala, kav Tohu, the line of Tohu, and avnei, and the stones of Vohu. It's a very cryptic verse. So he says, what does this refer to? So the Gemara says, Tana, Tohu zeu kav yoruk. That Tohu is referring to a green line. Shemakif es kol ha'elam kulei. That surrounds and encompasses the entire world. Shemamenu yotza cheshech, from which there's derived from there. That's the origin of darkness. Shenema yoshas cheshech sisrei. That God established darkness as his his hiding place. He established cheshech as sisrei, as his place where he hides, where he's concealed. So what do you see from this? That Tohu is a level of cheshech. The original, from there originates cheshech, like it says afterwards, v'cheshech al pnei ha'tahim. And Vohu, the Gemara continues, Elu ha'avonim ha'mefulmos shemehem yotzu mayim. These are the damp stones that from where originates water. Because it says afterwards, v'cheshech al pnei ha'tahim, there was darkness that covered all of existence. V'ruach elikim merachefes al pnei hamayim. And the Spirit of God's ruach, of God, hovered over the water. So where's the cheshech and the mayim coming from? So the Gemara says that the cheshech, the darkness, which is Beriyah, comes from Tohu, and the mayim comes from Vohu. So this is essentially, in other words, before it became actual darkness and then water, you had the level of Tohu of a Vohu, which Tohu is again like a green line. That's kav Tohu, a green line that surrounds kol ha'elam kulei. So it's encompassing. It's like an eagle, igulim. It surrounds it all, and that's where darkness originates from. And Vohu are the damp stones, basically the stones of the within the earth, within the ground. Shemimenu yotzu mayim, like he says there, from the tahim, the stones that are under the crust, under the crust of the earth, from where water originates, where the well springs come. So one is a state of that brings darkness, and the other one is where water begins to emerge. And like he says, "Va'ayin beRamban," the Ramban al Pasuk Bereshis, the Ramban in the Pasuk of Bereshis says that avonim hen suras habinyan. Avonim, when you talk about stones, you already have the stones are already the shape of a structure. Before you have stones, then you only have the concept. It's not yet been shaped. But once you have stones, and remember, avonim, hamafulmis, so the damp stones are the beginning of the shaping of existence. Sudas habinyan. Okay. What about Yoruk? What is this green line? So now he continues. Ubetikune zeir daftes seif Ayin Beis. And I did find that this section here of the Rebbe Rashab is based on, and more or less, the language of the Tzemach Tzedek and the Maimer on the Pasuk Va'aretz Ha'isa Tohu. The Tzemach Tzedek brings these sources. So this is somewhat taken from there. So what is he saying to Kunezeh? The page is 9, and the bottom 9b, the bottom of B. Mavur Yaruk Mesitra de Imeilah. Yaruk, which is green, comes from the side of Imeilah, Bina. The Ihi Tshuva, which is the level of Tshuva, Kav Yaruk, the Ischar L'Kol Alma. This is the Kav Yaruk, the green line, that Ischar, that surrounds the entire world. So it's essentially associating to the level of Bina, which is the level of Tshuva. Now this makes sense because we learned before that Bina is Beriyah, which is Igulim, and it's not yet shaped, the level of Nefesh. Like you said before, the level of Tohu. The Olam Hu B'china Zah, the world, the existence itself is the level of Zah. That's already a revealed and structured existence. And Bina is like Igulim. Compared to Zah, Bina surrounds, is like a makif, Igulim, that encompasses. And that's why it's like a green line that encompasses, it surrounds, and encompasses Lazah. Ukiyadua, as it's known, Be'inyan, Elakim Chaim, Umelech Elam. When we say Elakim Chaim, living God, and the King of the world, the Bina Nikra Melech Elam. Melech Elam means the King of the world, so he's like the King above the world. And Elakim Chaim, most likely, is referring to Zah, which is already the living God, meaning as it manifests in the level of Chaim, of life. Okay. So again, this is quite dense, very, very just no explanation, just giving us the levels. But briefly, what he just said now, he's connecting it before. Remember, we said Igulim Yesha, Beriyah Yetzirah, Nefesh Ruach. So now he's connecting that to Tohu and Vohu, that we learned before is Beriyah Yetzirah. And that's the difference between the Choshech, from the green line, which is the level of Bina. Bina too, we learned, Bina is, he said before, is the level of the Tagim, like the crowns, which are above and hover above, they're not revealed. And Zah, that's the revealed state of the midas, of the emotions, like we say, the mother that hovers over her Efrechim, over her chicks. So the mother is, in a sense, in a concealed state, and what's revealed is the midas of Zah, Olam. So it's consistent to everything we've been learning. Now this is, as I said, not much explanation, just establishing the levels of Beriyah Yetzirah, and he's connecting it to many different topics in the process of creation. If we were to flesh it out, basically it's going to come down to, in the interface, that Beriyah is closer to the source. That's why it's more concealed. Tohu is already closer to being shaped and formed, so it's more revealed and becomes something that's starting to develop as a shape, like he said, from where the water comes from the damp stones, which is already some form of shape. So when you think of the existence, how God created the world, first he created like a nebulous, everything was in one nucleus, like one cell. Everything was concentrated. And that's why it says, everything was created, but it was all in the state of Tohu. Tohu means we don't yet have shape and form, and we can't even describe what it is from the word Tohu, Mata B'nei Adam, that it's bewildering, it's baffling, it's not clear. What is this? Vohu is Yetzirah, the next stage after Beriyah, where it starts taking some shape. And that's where not just Choshech, darkness, but now the damp stones from which comes the water. So that's really beginning to take shape. And obviously there's still stages till it fully develops. Tikkun, the world of Asiya, when you have a full world. But he's focusing now on Beriyah and Yetzirah. So he brought the Gemara now, and he brought the Tikkunei Zehar, which just adds a little more in understanding this concept here. Before I continue, there's still more Kabbalistic terms and ideas that the Rebbe Rashab is introducing. I'll explain it line by line. But before I continue, let me stop if anybody wants me to clarify or if you have any questions.
Could you say why it's green? Why is it green?
Generally speaking, he doesn't say here explicitly, but he just says that green associates with tshuva, which is bina. Generally speaking, the color white is usually the color of purity, of like tzaddikim, where everything is cleansed. The color red is usually associated with gvura, with severity, with judgment, like fire. The color blue, whitish blue, is associated with water, chesed. The color green is usually a combination. It's referring to when you transform something like through tshuva. So it's transforming something from black, from a darker color, and you're transforming it to something that is light. So that's one of the reasons it's associated with the color green. That's one of the explanations. He doesn't go into it here because it's not really relevant to the discussion. He just refers to that. Now, green also, I mean, I have to do more research to see all the different aspects of it, why Tohu is associated with green. But again, what he says, Yaruk is mesitra de imei law. Yaruk comes from the left side, which is imei law, which is bina, the iyat tshuva. So let me do a little more looking into, and I'll come back with what I find. But that's what comes to mind from what I recall studying and learning about this.
Thank you.
Okay.
Beriyah is associated with Bina, and the Yetzirah is the Zah. But we always learn that Moach Shalad El Alev, and we need Bina. How could that be unformed? Generally speaking, we always talk about emotions. The babies need direction. They need to be formed by the mother, Bina. The Bina
That's
is
why Beriyah comes
providing
before
structure.
Yetzirah. That's why Bina comes before Zah, and that's why Beriyah comes before Yetzirah.
But it's referred to as Igulim, which is lack of structure, and Yosher.
You're mixing two separate things. You're asking what comes first. Beriyah comes before Yetzirah. Bina comes before Midas. Here, the focus is on the creation process. That first, in the context of a structure, if you only created existence with Bina, you wouldn't have a structured universe. You'd only have intellect. And Midas is where, like I explained yesterday, what life plays itself out in relationships, in the midas that we have, in our emotions and measurements. Midas is also from the word measurements and parameters. So a mother without children is without a structure. And the mother gives birth to the children. In the context of shape and form, the mother hovers above and is not begili to an existence. It remains, like he said, more of a makif compared to makif of Zah, as he calls it. Now, there's a lot of things about Bina and Zah that we haven't even addressed. We're not going to be able to reconcile everything into one picture. Right here, the focus is on from the Bina going into Zah, or from Beriyah into Yetzirah. That's the detail, the focus here. So there are many things about Beriyah and Yetzirah that we can talk about that are part of the discussion, but it's not what he's focusing here. Remember, Chassidus is a very vast study, and this is not an encyclopedia on everything about Beriyah or about Bina. It's what's relevant here to understand Beriyah Cheshach and Yetzer Eir. Remember, that's the expression, Yetzer Eir Beriyah Cheshach. So you could start saying, well, it's a Beriyah Cheshach. Why is the mother called Cheshach? So the explanation here, because it's in a more elevated state that is makif compared to Zah, where life plays itself out in the world of Midas. Okay. Any other questions or points of clarification? Okay, continuing. Ube'etz Chaim, Shar Mem Aleph Peri Gimel. In Eitz Chaim, Shar, 41st Shar, gate, chapter 3. So I can't even keep count any longer, but the Rebbe Rashab is already in this page alone, probably cited 8, 9, 10 times different Kabbalistic sources, which you don't find on every page, because as I said, he's really collecting this whole topic together. Clearly a lot of research went into it and connecting it to our discussion here. And so what he says is like this. 1 second. 1 minute. He brought an Eitz Chaim before. I want to see if it's connected to this. 1 second. Okay. So Shar Memal of Perek Zayin, Perek Gimel rather, chapter 3 says, the Ein Sof Nikra Efes. Ki Ein Beis Shum Tfisa. That Ein Sof is called Efes. Efes means nothing. We know there's a level of Ayin, there's a level of Efes. Remember, we learned about it before. Ein Arech Lecha Ba'elam Haza, on page at the bottom of page 1387, the Efes Biltecha. So Ayin also means nothing. But we learned there's two different levels of bittul. He said Ayin is the level that it's outside of the source. So the light, let's say the light of the sun, is completely nullified because it has no identity except for the sun. But then there's the light within the sun. And that's called Efes. It's a deeper level of bittul. So he says, Ein Sof is called Efes. Ki ein beis shum tfisa. Why do you call it nothing? Because there's nothing that we can hold on to. It doesn't yet have any substance. There's something there. It's called Ein Sof, but it doesn't have tfisa, as in we can't contain it. We can't define it. We can't contain it. Va'acharov, and the Eitz Chaim continues, and after that Efes, state of Efes, Yotza hatoyu v'hu keser. So first you had a state of Ein Sof, infinitude, and then from there came the level of Tohu, and that's the level of Keser. So this is now beginning to, you see, he's starting to explain, I can't say explain it, it's beginning to place it in levels that we've discussed earlier. There's, remember, Keser, there's Chachma, Vatzilas, Bina, Zah, and then come the worlds of Beriyah Yetzirah, Asiya, and so on. So I'll soon explain how it all fits in together, but let's first finish what he's going to say right now. So now he's introduced something else, something new. That before Tohu, there was a state of Efes higher than Tohu. So even though Tohu already is a state that we said before, Mata B'nei Adam, it's puzzling, bewildering. It's a state that baffles because we can't fully understand that level, what it is. Like he said before, Tohu, he used the words, I'm just reading inside. You can't call it by a name because it doesn't have a description or a shape yet, and yet there's a level of Efes that's even higher. So Tohu is referring to Keser now, and there's a level of Efes. So he says now like this. This is from the Tzemach Tzedek. And mashmois means the inclination, the appearance. Mashmois means the likelihood. In other words, it's not explicit in Eitz Chaim, but it appears to be the case when you read it. The intention appears to be the Efes v'Tohu, that Efes and Tohu now are two levels. What are the two levels? Ayin Beis b'chinas shebekeser. There are two levels in Keser. Next page, 1391. Now we're talking about two levels in Keser. Habchina tachtena shebemaitzel, bchinas atik nikra Efes. The lower level of the maitzel, in other words, the higher level of Keser is called the tachtena, the lower level of the emanator, meaning the source. That's called atik, and that's the level that's called nikra Efes. And the second level of Keser, ubchinas arich ampin of Keser, Sheiresh Shanetzalim, the root of the emanations, Nikra Tohu. That's called Tohu. Not level of Efes, this is a level of Ayin, also beyond comprehension, but it's already come to something that is beginning to relate to existence. So let me explain what he's saying here with a little more elaboration. Again, let me just repeat. Everything that had been said till now is really just stating facts. The Rebbe Rashab is not fleshing it out. He's not elaborating. He's not explaining it. I'm trying to do that, especially in the context of what we're studying here. But we're learning it exactly as it was written. So this is what he says. So let's define this a bit more. You may recall a very important line that he said on the page 1389. I just want to read it inside because it's a very critical line. of how everything in existence is developed through a process. Nothing just becomes pop. A child goes through 9 months of gestation in pregnancy, from that one cell of when it's conceived till it multiplies and splits until it becomes a full-blown healthy child. A seed is planted in the ground and takes time for it to develop and then sprout and ultimately blossom into a tree or a flower or whatever it ends up being. So he may set a line like this. I just want to read it inside. It's a very powerful line that sounds like a real klal, like a rule, a principle, an axiom that goes like this. I'm reading from middle of page 1389. You could underline it if you like. The creation of existence, of an entity, who be'efen kazeh is in this manner. It doesn't begin by being a full yesh, a literal full-blown entity. The way it works is, first, its beginning of its inception is that it's chaymer pashut. It's a shapeless blob, a shapeless raw matter. So it's gone from a state of nothingness. You've now something exists, but you can't call it yet a full entity. So you call it efsharis hametzias, the potential for existence. Lo b'bchinas metzias mamish. V'zeu b'chinas habriya. That's Bria. And then ba'achakach mitztayir b'tzir, and then the shapes begin to develop. Literally, like the best example is actually an embryo, is a fetus that's developing. First, it begins one cell, and that one cell will split, and then split again, and develop shape and form until it becomes a full child, a full-blown infant child. And the same thing is, for example, even conceptually. When you write a book or you write a business plan, you don't begin writing a full plan. You begin with points. You have yourself certain key points, bullet points or ideas, headlines, if you wish, chapter headings. And then you start fleshing them out. So it all begins with a concept that can be just a spark, like chokhmah. Then you develop it into bina, and then fully flesh out, and you have a full-blown document. The same thing is with art, with music, the same thing with anything that exists. That's the process. Now, we take it for granted that's how it works. But remember, God didn't have to create it that way. He intentionally made it that way because he wanted it to be a process that we can, with our intelligence, can understand and relate to and emulate. And additionally, that we can then retrace the steps. Because when we go backwards from the bottom up, we take the full-blown entity and we're looking for its source, its origins. This is essentially what scientists do when they're looking for the Big Bang. They try to go back in time to emulate events that happened back there when things were much more concentrated. So what we have now is an expanded universe or expanded entity, but you always want to always study and analyze its roots and origins, which will always come back to a seed somewhere, where it all started, where all the branches lead you back to its origins. In Avodas Hashem, it's the same thing. We live in a world, in a material world, and we want to understand where it comes from. And we want to reconnect with our source, with our creator, if you wish, with our mother, as some say in psychology. So we're always looking to go back to where the source is and connect the source to the details that is our life and existence. When you say that every person needs to have a mission statement, a business needs a mission statement, you're basically saying the mission statement is the core root of everything we're doing, all the activities. So all the details of our lives should be aligned with its core hub, which is what should be driving everything else. So essentially, that process is what we're discussing here. He's speaking about it in Kabbalistic terminology, so it can seem cryptic. When you really break it down, that's what he's really saying. Beriyah Yetzirah, Tohu Vohu, Igulim Yesher, Chaymer Tzura. Nefesh Ruach, Bina Zah, Beriyah Yetzirah. So now let's go back to the Eitz Chaim. The Eitz Chaim, remember, Kabbalah was not written for beginners. Anyone who read or studied Kabbalah, especially back then, had thorough knowledge of the entire Talmud, all the Rishonim and Achreinim, everything that existed in Jewish literature and scholarship. So when they start reading Eitz Chaim, they're not coming just, okay, here's a line from Eitz Chaim. Eitz Chaim was written for advanced, very highly advanced students. The Arizal was teaching it to his student, Rab Chaim Vital, and his other students. Rab Chaim Vital wrote it down. Chassidus, especially Chassidus Chabad, was the first that really explains it in language that people like ourselves who may not have any Kabbalistic knowledge, definitely not on that level, can begin to understand it. So you have to remember that when the Rebbe Rashab is writing here, he's writing as obviously a master Kabbalist, but he is writing it for us. So he is bridging and bringing them to expression here. So let me now elaborate a bit. What is this Eitz Chaim really saying? The Eitz Chaim is telling us how existence came to be. In other words, we don't just say God created the world and that's that, and from here on, the rest is history. In a way like what a scientist does. Kabbalah is teaching us the process. Again, now the Eibishter could have said, "Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'sa'aretz." God created heaven and earth, and just jump straight to day one. He created light. Day two, he created the heavens, the rakia that separates. Day three, vegetation. Day four, the cosmos, the luminaries. Day five, the animals and the fish and the birds, and day six, the human being. Or even more so, he could have skipped all the 5 days and just go straight. Created heaven and earth, put the human being, male and female, Adam and Eve, into the Garden of Eden, and said, serve and protect, elevate this existence. But no, the Torah specifically spells out the process even before humans existed. What happened on day one, and what happened on day two, and day three, the whole development, the process. And furthermore, it doesn't even jump from Bereshis to light. We know there's this cryptic second verse of Genesis, one of the most cryptic verses. The world was it was empty and void, is the usual literal translation. What does that mean? And what's toyu and what's voyu? And then cheshech hapnei astahim. And darkness was on the face of all of existence. Beruach Elokim, and the Spirit of God, merachefes al pnei hamayim, hovered over the water. What does that even mean? And that's where the Zohar, and especially Eitz Chaim, explains every one of those details. And then it says, Vayemer Elokim yehi or vayhi or. That God then said that let there be light. Out of the darkness came light, creation of light. So all this refers to deep cosmic secrets and cosmic levels of how the creation process took place. I don't know if any of you have ever seen a book called Bible Unauthorized. Then I think they renamed it recently. I saw another edition in the beginning, I think. This was written, the author is A.H. Moose. It was just a pseudonym, wasn't his real name. He was actually an individual, a scholar that would come around here in Crown Heights, and he had association with the Frierdiker Rebbe and the Rebbe. He would write a column in Hakriya Vagdusha, was a publication that the Frierdiker Rebbe gave out during World War II, during those years, 1945, 1944, 45. And he was a mysterious figure. Recently, people have written up who he was exactly. He would speak, he would visit the Frierdiker Rebbe, and he was a writer and a thinker. And he wrote a book called Bible Unauthorized. What he wanted to do was show how the Bible is really a very deep scientific book. And he shows how the verses in the Bible are completely misread. That's why he called it unauthorized. Because the authorized Bible, he says, the authorized translations are just very meaningless. They're just literal and cryptic and so on. And he explains all these first verses in Bereshis very much aligned with some of these ideas we're discussing. This was, remember, in the 40s. He wrote it in the 40s. And it's very much scientific.
MS.
Some say that's what it was a hint to, MS. And the Frierdiker Rebbe asked the Rebbe what his opinion was about this book. And he writes to the Frierdiker Rebbe that it's more or less, it's sound. There are some things that are questionable. That's what the Frierdiker Rebbe wrote a review of the book to the Frierdiker Rebbe. We have it. He wrote it out. But he said, the Rebbe says it could be used in giving classes, especially for academics and intellectuals and scientific minds, because it does explain the verses, the beginning verses of the Bible, of Bereshit, Genesis, in more scientific terms. Now, it's more of a science that was more like in the 40s and 40s, but it's still quite interesting. Just I'm saying it as an aside. I'm not saying you need to learn that to understand. This is obviously far more authoritative, if you wish, because this is the Eitz Chaim. So what is the Eitz Chaim saying? Let's read it slowly. He's saying that in the process of creation, the first thing is Ein Sof. Obviously, the first thing is God himself, what we would call Atzmus. But God, as we know, manifested from a built Metzias, from a non-existential reality that completely doesn't relate to anything we can ever even imagine. He emanated light. We call it Ein Sof, or sometimes just called Ein Sof. God is not Ein Sof. God is higher than Ein Sof. God is even higher than Ein Tchila, that he has no beginning, not just no end. But Ein Sof is basically, I like to describe it as like a divine field of energy, pure divine consciousness. But in this divine consciousness will begin the process that will evolve, not in time, but conceptually, into a full developed existence as we know it. And there are many, many steps. That's the whole Seder Shtalshus. When you talk about Eirei Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, you're talking about the levels of divine energy, this divine field of energy, that are really much more conceptual there than actual. But it's something we can talk about because Chassidus talks about it, so it gives us some language. But it's all within the divine consciousness, the divine Godhead, if you wish, where all this is taking place, but it's still not existence. The best example that we have for it is, think of an artist that's beginning to want to create art, but he's not even defined what the art is like, and he definitely hasn't created the art yet. It's all within his being. But even that's not an adequate example because God is not even an artist. Even that requires that God should manifest and want to be an artist. So bottom line is, it goes through stages. We learned about this at length at the end of volume 2. We learned it in Hemshech Tzadik Daled. So I'm not going to go through all the stages from the highest levels downward. Well, just suffice to say there's a level of Ein Sof where the Eitz Chaim calls Efes. Why is it Efes? Because there's nothing that we can define. It's undefinable. It's not something we can grasp or contain, and it doesn't have any description yet. The only thing you can say, it's Ein Sof. It's like a shapeless, seamless field of energy. If you wish, you can use an example in physics when they say an invisible quilt. When they talk about quantum mechanics, and obviously that's a much lower level. That's already existence. But just to use an example that there's like an invisible quilt. All of the universe is integrally connected, like through an invisible quilt, but we don't see the quilt. We see the detail. So imagine there was an invisible blanket or quilt right here, and someone placed objects on it. So you think the objects are all fragmented, separate objects, but they're not. They're all part of this invisible quilt, this field of energy that everything is placed there. And then it begins to start getting deterministic definition. So an indeterministic state is going to ultimately manifest in determinism. Or a state of probability will become a state of actuality. I'm just using an example how things go from a state of potentiality to a state of actuality or probability and so on. So in the highest levels, the parallel here would be this Ein Sof is like a level of Efes. Efes simply means we, people of definition, people of identity, our consciousness, which is all about parameters. If I say to you, here's an apple, you understand an apple has shape and form, you have a hand, you can grasp it. Our senses, our sensory tools, whether it's sight, sound, taste, touch, or smell, only experience things that have parameters. Even conceptual senses like the mind or the heart, emotions or intellect, it also needs to have parameters. 2 + 2 = 4 is not the same idea that the whole is greater than the part, for example. It's a different concept. So concepts too have their parameters. They're just conceptual parameters, what we call spiritual or conceptual time and space. But what we're talking here is beyond time and space. We're talking about something that has no grasp at all. But from there, God will begin to shape existence, but it's going to take more stages. Now we know in the Kabbalistic structure, after stages within the Godhead, where slowly the artist begins to envision art, and he envisions infinite possibilities, as I've discussed, spheres ein ketz, infinite possibilities. Then he chooses one, and he envisions what that one art is going to look like, the 10 hidden spheres before the tzimtzum. Then, only then comes the tzimtzum, that he will conceal that intensity and allow for an independent consciousness to emerge. And that's where we call hishtalshelus, existence begins to develop. And even that goes through many stages. So I'm going to skip that level of tzimtzum because he's not addressing it here. He's going from Ein Sof, which can be even Ein Sof after the tzimtzum, frankly, Efes, and Acharav Yotza HaTohu. So in other words, after the Ein Sof comes Tohu. So God doesn't just leap from that state of Efes, of non-definition altogether, to definition. The definitions slowly develop. Like we said before, it doesn't go from Ayin to Yesh. It slowly first is Tohu. So Tohu is already one step below the Efes. This is called Ayin. It's still a state of amorphous state, a state that doesn't have shape and form, but it's already something that you can talk about. However, you can't describe it yet. So what does he call that? The first level he calls the first level of Keser, Atik. Atik represents the Maitzil. Maitzil is the emanator, God. God as he manifests as an emanator, a source. The lowest level of that source is called Atik. And that's the higher level of Keser. Keser then has the next level, the lower level of Keser that will become the source of the emanations. So if the creator is here, and the bottom of the creator would be the lowest level, I wouldn't say the bottom, that's not the right expression. The lowest level is how the creator is already beginning to identify, but it's still an extension of the creator, not the creation. That would be Atik Efes, what he called Ein Sof. Then comes Arich Ampin. This is where God is already now identifying with an existence, but it's still not shaped, and that's Tohu. That's the second level, which he calls Sheirish and its own taker, and that's the level of Ayin She'ena Musik. It's still not comprehensible, but it's not completely beyond. And he's going to explain what that means shortly. Two levels that we learn about, something that's concealed, but you can still somewhat relate to it, and something that's Helen Be'etzem, something that's completely beyond. And once we learn that, we'll understand that the Rebbe Rashab is connecting this to the fundamental theme of Ayin Beis, which is all about the interface between these two levels, between the non-existential to the existence, between the divine and existence. And that's why these stages are so critical, because they allow us stepping stones to move from the top down and from the bottom up. Like I said, that's how you create an interface. For us to have an interface with the divine, you have to have stepping stones. You have to have a ladder. You have to have something that we have in common. So Tohu is the first step outside of Ein Sof of Keser that goes to Arich Ampin. But it's still Tohu. It's not Vohu. It's not Yetzirah yet. It's now a form of Beriyah. But it's still a Chaimer She'ein Musik. So that's some explanation, a bit of what we just learned in the Eitz Chaim with elaboration. Let me just see here if I should read on, because I'd rather go slower than faster. So I think I'm going to stop here, actually. I'm going to stop here because every line requires more explanation because it's quite dense. So going slower, I think, will be wiser. I'm going to stop at Eina She'eina Musik, but I'll stop for questions if anybody wants to ask anything. Quite fascinating stuff, right?
What is it? Ein Sof below the tzimtzum?
Once you decipher it, huh?
What is it? What you said is Ein Sof below the tzimtzum. What is that?
He's not talking about the tzimtzum here. So Ein Sof, for all practical purposes, being that it's Keser, the higher level of Keser, I wouldn't address it about Ein Sof Lifnei tzimtzum. I just use that for context. But the Olam is Ein Sof, before Atzilus, we call them Ein Sof too. So Atik could be called Ein Sof, like he's calling it here. So all practical purposes, Atik. There is an Atik that's similar above Ak, after the Tzimtzum, that originates from before the Tzimtzum, but that's, I don't want to go into that here. Here, Ein Sof simply means the first level of manifestation of Ein Sof. And he doesn't get into whether it's before or after the Tzimtzum. You can explain it either way. I would probably explain it after the Tzimtzum because it would fit more into the context of Keser. But it's all microcosm, macrocosm anyway. So whatever you find after the Tzimtzum, you can find before the Tzimtzum as well. Any questions?
Your use of astrophysics and quantum mechanics is really helpful, frankly, and it's unbelievable. I mean, how it's not just a muscle. I mean, I don't think we can understand it better in that sense. It's a muscle, but it sure sounds like it's coinciding with the Kabbalah, the way the Kabbalah is explaining the development of the world.
Absolutely. And I'll take it a step further. What we're discussing about creating a series of classes on this, that this where it has not yet been developed in the secular world, is in psychology. Remember, the psychological states as well. The superconscious is more like the Ein Sof, the quilt, and the two levels of Keser, and then there's the consciousness. How consciousness emerges from the superconscious.
Phenomenal.
So this has very far-reaching implications. Absolutely.
Wonderful. There was a book a couple decades ago. Actually, now it's probably 3-4 decades, written by Gerald Schroeder, called Genesis and the Big Bang. Have you heard of it?
Yeah.
Have you assessed whether that is consistent? Does that have good muscles?
Yeah. It's consistent. I don't think, if I recall correctly, that he brings much Kabbalah or Chassidus. He does it more through science and the verses in Genesis and Talmud. So I think it would have, if I recall correctly, I think it would have been enriched that he brought also this, but the ideas are parallel. Yeah, they're very similar and very consistent.
No, I was just thinking that it would be great if someone could write this up in that way. I mean, it sounds like this fellow in the 40s, I didn't catch his name, but it sounds like that's what he tried to do, but he didn't have access to modern science and how the secular science has developed these concepts.
Yeah, so. He also doesn't really bring Kabbalah. He does it more in a scientific terms, but it's correct. There are people who are considering, definitely deserves an updated version to associate it. I mean, it would be wonderful to have a collaboration between a top scientist who really knows the cosmology and all that, and as well as theoretical physics and the ideas that we're talking about here, for sure.
Maybe I should reach out to a cosmologist or astrophysicist at Stanford.
You have to, first of all, they have to have respect, because some of them dismiss these ideas.
Of course,
they don't even want to listen. But some who have been exposed are quite blown away.
Yeah.
Ironically, the problem is, as Dr. Professor Baranover told me a few times, that once you learn Chassidus and Torah, even though he was, a scientist, he says everything reverse happens. You start looking like science as child's play, and you don't. Not that you lose respect for it, but he says it's not. It's only about. It's like someone who's an auto mechanic. He told me once. Imagine an auto mechanic, and when you discover what the creator of the automobile is. So we really need somebody who can. The problem is when people start learning too much Chassidus, then they don't care about the science so much. I don't mean it in a negative way. I just mean it becomes less important to them. Scientists, like he told me, science was his religion. It was his God. There was nothing else for him. But then when he discovered God, so the science became like, just like I need to know how to brush my teeth. So you need to know how the dynamics of the universe work. but the truth is, it really deserves a true collaboration, the best of all the worlds. I think it would be unbelievable.
Yeah.
I always have a dream that maybe we'd have a physicist or a cosmologist would come up with an idea that would win a Nobel Prize, and he would get up and say the idea was spawned in an Ayin Beis class.
What about Dr. Presby? Do you know Dr. Presby at all?
Dr. Presby?
He's a physicist, and he teaches in the gateways. He used to teach in the gateways, but I mean, he worked for Bell Labs. He worked with Arno Penzias, but I don't think he's into Hasidus. I mean, he's a scientist who's an observant Jew.
Well, I'd be open with anyone. I don't think there's any limitation. It all comes down to we can get his interest, and if he's the
Okay.
right person, by all means. I mean,
I'll look into it.
Absolutely. I mean, I think to me it's exciting. Just the cross pollination and the collaboration of different schools of thought
Mhm.
would be
I
unbelievable.
think we need it. I think it's really necessary, because
And
I
if you
don't
come away with a psychological model that helps people actually in their lives, that would be the ultimate. Then it's not just
Totally.
not just scientific; it's also practical.
totally. But there are people that you could reach that you couldn't reach with that kind of psychology.
Absolutely,
That we could reach with
absolutely.
science. Yeah.
The credibility. Look, the
Mhm.
Templeton, the Templeton
Foundation.
world. Yeah, the Templeton Foundation. They give a grant every year to someone who comes up with both a scientific and spiritual or religious idea. They probably also have some individuals there that are that deal with this type of stuff. There are definitely scientists that have studied Kabbalah. I've seen it, not necessarily in the religious context, but they've definitely taken ideas, as well as others, artists, and so on. There is, they even call it Christian Kabbalah. Some people have a thing called Christian Kabbalah, whatever that is.
Yeah. Apparently, Michelangelo did. I learned.
I am sure anyone. I know that that the artist, what was his name, Mark Rothko, who one of these greatest artists in the 60s, and actually a Russian Jewish born artist, took his life at the end of the 60s. He was definitely studying Arizal and Tzimtzum and stuff like that, where he was deconstructing, because they want to deconstruct the universe. And Kabbalah helps you really do that, because it takes it back to the building blocks, to the raw elements that we're learning about before the construct began, which is really what science, what are they trying to do when they go back to like the second of after the Big Bang, through ultra tremendous speeds or so on? They're trying to replicate and they're trying to induce a state that existed right in the beginning, where there was that first explosion or burst or Big Bang and so on. That's what everyone's trying to deconstruct to get back to what the core elements. Yeah. Okay, good stuff. So we'll stop here, second line on page 1391. And